Hello! This is Chapter 7 over Listening Actively. But before we get into it, there are two things that I want to tell you as a caveat for listening that I want you to keep in mind. Listening is not always easy. It takes effort. Okay? It's easy when we're interested in it or when we have a stake in the outcome of something, but it takes effort, and sometimes we don't put that effort in. It's not always something that's really easy. So keep that in mind. I think a lot of people forget that and don't really put that into perspective for themselves. All right, the listening process. There is a difference between hearing and listening. And I know we know this on a theoretical standpoint, but I'm sure your parents, and maybe you've said it now that you're a little bit older, if you're like, are you listening? And someone says, yeah, I can hear you. It's like, that's not what I asked. If I asked if you were listening, okay? So, excuse me, I'm sorry. So, hearing and listening are two different things. The definition for hearing is right there, a physiological activity that occurs when sound waves hit our eardrums. The definition for listening is basically being broken down in the steps to the listening process. So I'm just going to go over those. Receiving is where you take in the message, obviously, but it also includes kind of mentally preparing to listen, as corny as that sounds. Again, listening isn't always easy. It takes effort. So sometimes it's about getting us in the right mind frame of like, okay, I need to focus. I might not care about what this person's saying or whatever, but I need to focus. It could also be like putting away distractions, putting your phone down, turning the TV down, stuff like that. Attending is where you kind of attend to the message and you kind of try to decipher the message. So for example, and you'll want to write this down. I don't know. It might show up. It might show up on the exam. For example, attending could be like if you're trying to organize the message and think and figure out, okay, are they seeking support or advice? Okay, because depending on what they're seeking, your response is going to be very different, and it should be. Okay. Understanding is where you make meaning out of their communication. So understanding is kind of where you set in your mind and you might say like, oh, okay, they're seeking advice. And then that adjusts to, how you listen. Interpreting communication is where you interpret what they're saying, really similar to understanding, where you have interpreted what they're saying and taken it in and made meaning out of it. And then responding is pretty obvious. I want to remind you, though, that responding occurs a lot of times more than we realize. It's not what I'm trying to say is we respond throughout the message, right? It's not always just the person talking and then we respond. We might respond by nodding non-verbally. We might respond by giving a quick like, oh, yeah, I remember her. So we respond, but that can happen while the message is still being conveyed. And then recalling or remembering. That's an interesting one, but it's a really, really important part of the listening process, remembering. So no one is saying that they expect you to remember every single thing that a person says, but remembering their message can communicate kind of what you think about the relationship. And it can mean a lot to the person and show them that you were, in fact, listening, especially if you bring it up later. If someone mentions like, oh yeah, I'm going to my grandma's 80th birthday party at work, and then, you see them on Monday and you say, hey, how's the party? That really means a lot. And remembering is just a good thing to do, again, to show your care for the relationship. All right. 4 listening styles. I'm going to start at the bottom. I need to just switch this slide around, but these are learned early on in life, and we often use 2 and resist attempts to use a different style than our dominant one, even if it's not the most effective for that situation at hand. Okay, so keep these in mind. Action-oriented listeners. Action-oriented listeners are those who listen to be able to take action. Those who listen to be able to take action. They are wanting a concise message. They want the person to get straight to the point so they can take action and know what to do next. Okay? Time-oriented listeners, these types of listeners will always let you know like how much time they have for the message that you're going to say. So even if you see them, they might be like, hey, I've got 10 minutes. What's up? They are very focused on the amount of time. So just like action-oriented listeners, they want concise information. Okay. Now, I don't want y'all to automatically think that time-oriented listeners are any busier than any other listeners. You don't have to be completely booked to be a time-oriented listener. It is just someone that is very aware of time. They're very mindful of how much time they have to listen, how much time they have for that conversation, so they can go do other things. Okay? But that also doesn't mean that they don't care. People-oriented listeners, these types of listeners listen to connect. They listen to make a connection. Okay? They're people-oriented. They want to know the details. They want to know how it affected that person, what they think about that situation, stuff like that. And then content-oriented listeners are really focused on the content. So the difference in these and action-oriented, action, like I said, they're trying to take action. Content, they're just really trying to understand the content of the message. So they might engage in clarifying questions, and your textbook even specifically says that's not them. If they ask follow-up clarifying questions, it's not them trying to be, like nitpicky or, I don't know, like challenging you. It's them. They truly are trying to understand the content that you're saying. Okay? All right. Obstacles to effective listening. External obstacles occur away from us and things that are external to us, go figure, and internal obstacles happen within us. So let's go over these. External obstacles, message overload. Y'all have probably heard of this before. Message overload is where the volume of messages coming at you is just so overwhelming that we just get overwhelmed and we don't listen. So that can happen the example I give is like, if I know some students just take classes 2 days a week so that they can work and do other stuff on the other days of the week. And if you do that and you're taking a full load, you're like back to your high school years where you're in class probably from 8 or 8:30 a.m. to 3 or 4. And I bet by the end of your class, especially if they're lecture heavy, you might engage in message overload, where it's just you've been sitting for hours just listening to content, where it might be hard to listen. Even if you want to, you just have so much coming at you, okay? Message complexity is where the message itself is complex and we have trouble understanding it, so it just goes over our head and we don't listen. This can happen if we are talking to someone about a topic that we don't know a lot about, but we engage because we want to be nice, and then we're trying to, keep up, and then they just go more into detail and we're caught on this last thing, and then it just goes over our head, okay? And then environmental factors. Environmental factors are anything in our physical environment that can get in the way of us listening. So it could be someone clicking their pen behind you. It can be the temperature of the room. It can be, like the weather outside. If I teach in a classroom with windows, it's always so funny. Students get so enthralled when it starts raining, or at least in Texas. I know it barely rains here in Colorado, but students are so amazed and they just stare outside when it's raining. And that, that can be a distraction or an obstacle to listening. All right, internal obstacles. Preoccupation is where we are preoccupied. Our mind is somewhere else. So if you have an exam in your next class, the class before that, you might have trouble listening because you're just preoccupied. Prejudgment, that is where we have judged that person or that message and decided that it's not worth our time or our effort to listen to, so we just don't listen, okay? So that can be, we do this a lot with politics, right? Like we might just assume, I know what this person's going to say and what they believe in, so I'm just not going to listen to them. And then lack of effort. Like I said, listening isn't always easy. It takes effort. And sometimes we just flat out don't put that effort in, okay? All right, now let's finish with forms of incompetent listening. Pseudo-listening is listening Pseudo-listening is pretending to listen. I don't know why I got ahead of myself. Pseudo-listening is pretending to listen. Pretending to listen. I don't need to give y'all an example because we do this all the time, right? Hopefully not too much, but we do it. Monopolizing is where you monopolize the conversation and you might be listening just to respond in a way to where you want to steer the conversation. In monopolizing, there can be what's called diversionary interrupting or rerouting, which is where you interrupt to divert the conversation somewhere else. It might be something that interests you more. It might be bringing the conversation back to something about yourself, stuff like that. Something I want to emphasize though is just because you mention yourself in a conversation, that's how we relate. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're monopolizing. If you're talking to someone and you're like, yeah, we're for spring break, we're going to go on a cruise. And you're like, oh my gosh, we went on a cruise this summer. That doesn't necessarily mean you're monopolizing. Monopolizing, it's there when it's to a certain degree. Okay, you kind of know it when you see it. Selective listening is where you listen to only select parts of the message. You listen only to select parts of the message. So it might be because it's interesting to you. It might be because you think that only this part of the meeting pertains to you, stuff like that. Defensive listening is where we listen and it kind of goes through a filter. We listen with the lens and the perception that it is a personal attack when that is not what is intended. We perceive it as a personal attack when that is not what was intended. Okay? So, for example, if you're sitting with someone before class and you have a test coming up and you're like, hey, have you started studying for the test? If they were engaging in defensive listening, they might respond with like, no, I haven't started studying for the test that's next week. I have a child. I work full time. I'm a part-time student. So no, I haven't started studying for the test. And you're like, whoa, right? But they got very defensive. The key thing there is that they perceive it as a personal attack when that's not what's intended. If someone just throws out a personal attack and you respond, you're not defensive listening because they did personally attack you. Ambushing is where you listen very carefully to use it against them. You listen very carefully, but so that you can use that information against them. The easiest example I can give you is the stereotypical movies with lawyers, right? When someone's on the stand and they're like, what did you do earlier that day? They don't actually care. They're asking so that they can hear inconsistencies in your story with what you said earlier in your statement or whatever, okay? And then literal listening is listening only to the content level of meaning and not to the relationship level. Now, let's go back to chapter 1. Remember, there is a difference between content level. Content level is just the basic definition. Relationship level, it might mean something different in that relationship. I gave y'all the example of dumb, right? It would mean something different if you and your friend were joking around and they were like, you're so dumb, than if I passed you your paper and I said, you're so dumb, right? That would mean something so different, right? And how you take that. So literal listening would be where you don't take into consideration the relationship meaning of the message. So what this can look like, let's say you are not very close with your mom. You don't speak, in fact, and your coworker knows this. So you go into work and you're close with your coworker and they're like, what's up? You're acting weird. And you're like, my mom texted me last night. If they were engaging in literal listening, they might respond with like, yeah, so did mine. Cool. Anyway, what time do you want to get lunch? Okay. They're not taking into account what that means for you. Okay. So that is it for listening. I just want to emphasize that listening is really, really important. I feel like there could be an entire class on listening. It's not always easy, and it can be a huge problem in relationships, whether it's a friendship, whether it is a romantic relationship, family, and it can obviously be an immense problem in work relationships and in your job in general. So don't sleep on listening because it is very, very important and very, very underrated.